Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back from our episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, subsidized government grocery stores will sell meat, other basics at 30% off, Mamdani says, posted by socialists or morons, and that's the story from the Washington Post, and they added, all hail moron Mamdani. And yeah, personally, I think the Libertarian position is that, if people do want to pay for their government-run grocery stores, they should be able to. With that being said, I think, the libertarian position is, you have to have the privates. You don't want to have the state give the state too much control or anything like food, because that doesn't usually tend to end well. Just look at the Soviet Union and any time that communism's been tried. And yeah, personally, if they want to justify paying for this, I think they should be able to, but I don't think they should be forced to do so if they don't want to. And under the current system, you're pretty much forced to pay for anything when it comes to this government, if the people in charge want to pay for it, and that's true regardless of if you're at the local, state, or federal level. And yeah, that's my thoughts on. And then I also wanted to add that there was a good post about this on the Shit State of Stay subreddit, and I think it was a comment chain from this thread, and and one guy said, we have public police forces, why not public grocery stores? And I said, why not just have a government worker wipe your ass and tuck you into bed at night? I'm sure Redditors would love it. If Redditors want to pay for that, I think that's fine. But, I don't think people should be forced to pay for that if they don't want to. And it's the exact same when it comes to government-run grocery stores. Next we have, Trump invents the corporate pardon, posted by Fear the Creeper, and it's an article from the New Republic, and they added, Trump has granted 9 pardons for corporations. One of them was a crypto company, BitMEX, who introduced the Trump meme coin. And yeah, personally, if Trump wants to pardon corporations, that's not, he can pardon whoever he wants to. That's the president's pardon power. I don't really care when Joe Biden pardoned Dr. Fauci or his son Hunter, but he has the ability to do that. But Reddit hates it when Trump has the same ability to pardon whoever he wants to. It just goes to show you the state's always going to look after for themselves first and foremost, and that's true regardless of which self-interested knucklehead is in power, be it Sleepy Joe or Sleepy Don. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, Autumn Hill speaks after being sentenced to 50 years for terrorism by the White House. And that's posted by knee concussions, and that's a video from Uncloseted Media. And yeah, personally, Reddit, of course, is always gonna defend someone like Autumn Hill, since she's a transgender leftist. Even though she was hanging around a murderer during the Prairie Land debacle. But of course, Reddit, if it was up to Reddit, none of the Prairie Land defendants would be found guilty, even the one who murdered the guy. And it just goes to show you that, Reddit, if it was the same thing, but they were out-group rather than in-group, Reddit would say throw the book at all of them. But since this is in-group rather than out-group, Reddit says, they didn't kill anyone, they were just around there, they don't deserve to be held accountable. Ultimately, I think, you should probably hold anyone accountable for political violence who takes part in it. I think 50 years might be a bit much, even if, you especially since she wasn't the one who killed the guy, but ultimately, Reddit, if this was the out group rather than the in group, Reddit would be saying 50 years would be completely justified, but since it's the in group rather than the out group, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. Next we have, teacher arrested for repeatedly clapping in favor of data center opponents during city commissioner meeting, from KCBD.com, posted by Third Culture Kid, and I actually responded to this on the post on the cross post they made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, and because I can't comment on this subreddit since they banned me almost 2 years ago now, but they can't censor me on YouTube as well. I'm gonna continue doing this until I literally can't anymore, because that's what freedom of speech is. Freedom of speech. You're allowed to say whatever you want to, even if no one's listening. Because the Reddit censorship brigade thinks they can censor anyone who dissents at all permanently, and that's not true. Just because you're censored in the Reddit community or banned from Reddit entirely doesn't mean your freedom of speech goes away. And that's why I do this podcast, because even if no one watches it, it's still getting under their skin, and and getting under the skin of the Reddit censorship brigade is probably one of the best things you can do. Next we have anyway, yeah, I was I did in regards to that post I said on the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, I said they really can arrest you for anything. I personally don't think you should be arrested for just clapping during a city commission meeting, but ultimately if they want to justify arresting you for that, they have the monopoly on the legal use of force to justify arresting you for that, and ultimately there's nothing you can really do about it, because they're in a position of state authority. You could say, oh, this is false imprisonment, I don't consent to being arrested, but they have the monopoly of the legal use of the force of the state use of force on their side, so they can pretty much justify doing whatever they want to. And oftentimes you can't even hold them accountable for it, because the state controls the courts and legal system as well. Next we have actions have consequences, and that's a cross post posted by ShadowNets5462, and that's a cross post from the Ask the Donald subreddit. And let's see, that's looks like a video of someone got 2.5 years for assaulting a federal immigration officer. This must be another one of the Prairie Land defendants, I guess. And yeah, personally, if you want to justify assaulting anyone you want to assault, justify doing whatever you want to. With that being said, I think it's a stupid idea to go out to assault federal officers, because that's just asking for trouble. I personally don't care for a lot of federal officers, but they can justify, because they can justify pretty much doing whatever they want to. But ultimately, if you want to believe that you justify assaulting them, that's fine, but don't be surprised when you're in a shitload of trouble as a result. And yeah, I personally would agree with that actions do have consequences, and ultimately, when it comes to the state, their actions don't have consequences. Just look at Donald Trump. He can pretty much say whatever he wants to, and he's pretty much will face no consequences. He's had the 2 impeachments, but they didn't really amount to anything. So, ultimately, I think my position on this would be, actions do have consequences, but, if you have enough state power, your actions might not have consequences, but, if you're a peasant like I am, actions very much do have consequences, especially if you act against the state, who, if you don't, they can pretty much justify doing whatever they want to. Trying to go after them is only going to be asking for trouble. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, do you support globalism and one world order, posted by version 2 Hummus, and they added, like a unified global state, why and why not? Thank you for your clarifications. And yeah, personally, I would say I'm the exact opposite of that. I think the libertarian position is, we should support secession down to the individual level. If you don't like how your community is run, you should have every right to opt out of it. And globalism is very much the opposite of that. One world order means, one system of government, and that's just one, and that's why, I think you should be against that. I think the ideal country should be as small as possible, even if it's just the size of one homestead. And thankfully, countries have been getting smaller over the past century or so. Just look at Europe on a map of Europe on the outbreak of World War I compared to a map of Europe today. The countries are getting smaller, even if they have stuff like the European Union, which is essentially acting like a country, even if it's a supposedly multinational union. I personally don't care for that, but ultimately I do think the libertarian ideal is countries should be as small as possible, not as big as possible, and one global government would definitely go against that. Next we have, the IRS is imploding, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Collapse subreddit, and that's an article from Mother Jones. The CEO says the agency is the IRS is imploding. And then the OP added, basic government services are collapsing and imploding, as the article states in this title. Before Doge and Musk, nobody really had issues with paperwork and filing, right? In this article, it looks like government staff are short of manpower and funding, and that is not by mistake. What kind of scenario are we looking at in early 2027 if tax refunds go unanswered in the midst of potential ground war in Iran, a government shutdown, gridlock between Dem control or both houses and Trump, 1/3 of income tax revenue pays the interest, and 10 years is supposed to be half, and if anyone here worried that overtime tax refund payout in 2026 is going to come back to bite them in the ass in 2027, I'm really hoping that that money sign SLS doesn't do its buyout this year, but it looks like the IRS is dropping the ball on purpose. And when you have advice and taking extra precautions to go everything's sorted in 2027. And yeah, personally, this is some typical Reddit doomerism. I personally don't care for the IRS. I could only wish it implodes. But ultimately, social media is always acting like the sky is falling or the world is ending. But it's a lot like Chicken Little or The Boy Who Cried Wolf. When they say it constantly, it just goes to show you that when you say it the first time, maybe people would have attention. When you say it the 1,000th time, people just kind of don't tune it out. The IRS that might look like something Harvard Jones might say the IRS is imploding, but in reality, they're just going to keep on going. It's like how a lot of people said the world is ending when Trump was first elected president in 2016, and here we are 10 years later, and nothing really much has changed. And it just goes to show you that you can always say the sky is falling or the world is ending, but that doesn't necessarily make it so. Personally, I don't think we're going to be lucky enough to see the American empire collapse in my lifetime. Because, inherently, even if it is a bureaucratic mess, it still seems like, nothing meaningful will change as long as the current system's in place. And I don't know how likely it is the current system is to collapse, despite, Reddit thinks it's going to happen any day now, but they've been saying that for well over a decade, and and nothing really meaningful has changed. Despite social media hyping it up so much, maybe one day it will happen, but I'm not really holding my breath because those in positions of power are too entrenched in the system for it to meaningfully collapse anytime soon, I would say. Next we have Trump keeps pushing legally dubious tariffs, posted by Jedi Porcupine, and that's an article from Reason.com. And yeah, personally, I think that, I don't really care for tariffs. They're just a tax on imported goods, and Libertarian position is if you don't want to pay a tax, you shouldn't be forced to do so. But with that being said, ultimately, if Trump wants to push whatever he wants to push, the executive branch is in charge of enforcement. So, ultimately, it doesn't really matter what the Congress or the Supreme Court says. They're not the ones enforcing the laws. It doesn't matter what actually the law says. It matters how they're enforced, and the executive branch is in charge of enforcement. So ultimately, that's on. That's gonna be, if he wants to justify implementing all these tariffs, ultimately he's able to, and ultimately there's really nothing he can do about it. Next we have border agents can lie to search your phone, but wiping your own data could land you in prison, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think that border agents shouldn't have that ability to lie and search your phone. And if you want to wipe your own data, you should be able to. But ultimately, if the state wants to rule either of those three crimes, the state's in a position to enforce anything it wants to. As we said earlier, they can arrest you for clapping at a city commission meeting, and ultimately they can arrest you for whatever reason they want to. It doesn't really matter what's on the paper. It matters what they want to justify at any given moment. Next we have sycophants are planning to overthrow the Constitution for their dear leader, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's cross-post from the Black People of Reddit subreddit, and that's it looks like a TikTok or something. Can Trump serve for a term? Trump nominated judge won't say. And yeah, personally, I'm tired of Trump, but ultimately, eventually the Reddit and the woke leftists will move on to the next boogeyman. I remember back when I was a kid, it was Texas man bad. Now it's Orange man bad. Soon it might be, hillbilly man bad if they ever do successfully take Trump out, which I'm not holding my breath. The people who want to take out Trump the most are the least competent when it comes to actually doing it. They're basically your typical basement-dwelling Reddit moderator types. And yeah, personally, it doesn't really matter how long Trump's in there for. What matters is if any meaningful change comes to the system at all, and I don't see that happening. It's just more social media hype. When it comes to Orange Man bad, and eventually, after 4,000 plus days of it, you just kind of grow numb to it. Eventually, there'll probably be a new boogeyman, as I said, and then he'll be the worst thing ever, and so on and so forth, And that's pretty much politics is. Nothing really changes but the names. And sadly, ultimately, social media, people have more ability than ever to question what the official narrative is. But when it comes to stuff like Reddit, they'll just eat whatever the legacy media shits out, and ultimately, there's nothing you can really do about it. They're textbook NPCs. They don't think for themselves. They think whatever the legacy media tells them to think. It's kind of like my parents. They'll believe whatever ABC News tells them. They don't think for themselves. Next, we have Rand Paul, Kentucky, orders Capitol Police to remove David Schertler, the attorney for Dr. Anthony Fauci, from a high-profile congressional hearing after a series of tense verbal escalations posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's cross-post from the Law subreddit. And this reminds me, this is kind of like a post I did to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. I said, live updates, Anthony Fauci pleads the fifth during contentious Senate hearing from NBC News. And I posted that, and I said in the comments, Reddit, Trump pleading the fifth means he's obviously guilty. Only guilty people plead the fifth. Also Reddit, St. Fauci has every right to plead the fifth as much as he wants to. He did nothing wrong since I am completely incapable of questioning whatever narrative the legacy media shits out. And yeah, personally, if Reddit wants to be justified that, they should be able to, ultimately, I don't think it really matters. It's, as George Carlin said, it's a big club, you ain't in it, and Dr. Fauci is a member of that big club. He's never going to be held accountable for his actions, just like a lot of them will never be held accountable, because ultimately, when it comes to being held accountable, those in positions of authority are generally never going to be held accountable, and sometimes you just have to cope with that. And yeah, personally, I think, it just doesn't really matter what happens in the long run, because they're all complicit in when it comes to enabling Fauci, and so it doesn't really matter. They might act like they're holding me accountable, but it's all just theater. That's pretty much all government is. It's just theater. It's all just a distraction from the fact that they're all pretty much getting along behind the scenes, and they might come after each other at social media or in the House or the Senate. But in reality, it's all just theater. They're all just part of the elite class who seek to rule over us forever, and it looks like they're succeeding at that. Next, we have man who stabbed Salman Rushdie in 2022 convicted of federal terrorism charges, from TheGuardian.com, posted by Blue Housing. I personally think that, I personally don't really care for the term terrorism at all. But with that being said, I definitely do think if you stab someone, you should probably be convicted for that. And yeah, personally, I don't agree with a lot of stuff that the courts rule, but I definitely would agree that this person who stabbed someone else should be held accountable. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Incel Libertarian, hosted by Superb Donkey 1408, and they said, I'm an incel, and people always tell me it isn't a right to have a girlfriend, but how come it's a right to have kids or an abortion after choosing to have sex? I have to pay taxes to pay for poor people to have children for their education and healthcare, or to pay for a woman's abortion. If people were willing to have sex, they should be required to pay for the consequences. I personally have money to pay for these kinds of things, but no woman would date me since I was born short of autism. Parents who can't afford to have kids or abortions after having consensual sex should go bankrupt. And personally, I guess I would kind of agree with that. I think if you want to pay for people's abortions or their food or their education or healthcare or food, you should be able to. But ultimately, you should be able to pay for whatever you feel like. If you want to pay for other people, you should be able to. But you shouldn't be forced to do so if you don't want to, and that's pretty much what you're forced to do under the current taxation system. You're forced to pay for them, and ultimately, I personally don't think that's very libertarian. The libertarian position is, a voluntary system rather than the forced collectivist system that we have currently. It's a lot like the post I just made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit earlier today. I said, change my view. Government should operate like a streaming service. I said when it comes to streaming services, Netflix, HBO Max, Paramount Plus, Disney Plus, Peacock, etc., you're allowed to subscribe to as many as you want to and watch whatever programs on them that you want to. When it comes to the government, you're basically forced to subscribe 3 of them, local, state, federal, and you don't even get to determine what they give you. You can technically vote for representatives at each level, but since so many people are dead set on either the red show or the blue show, you're basically stuck with one of those. Not all their programming is bad. Stuff like the fire department at the local level can be helpful in times of emergency, for instance, but you really aren't given the agency to really choose what you want to do with them. They can spend your taxpayer $10, which you are forced to pay if to all three of them on whatever bullshit they want to, and there's basically no way to hold them accountable. In my system, you can choose what governments you want to subscribe to and what you don't. If you want to pay for something like the fire department, you should be able to, but you shouldn't be forced to do so if you don't want to. Also, and if you don't like how the current fire department is operating, you should be free to start your own. State-enforced monopolies are very antithetical to liberty. Thoughts? And yeah, that's how my system of government works. If you want to pay for something, you should be able to. If you want to pay for helping the poor or the disabled or military or the military or the fire department or the police, you should be able to, but you shouldn't be forced to do so if you don't want to. And right now, you're pretty much forced to do so if you don't want to, even if you don't want to, and you don't even get to determine where the taxpayer money goes, because they're in a position of, you don't even get to earmark where taxpayer dollars go, because the people in the positions of authority get to spend them on whatever they want to, and oftentimes there's no way to hold them accountable. I'm sure if a Democratic representative spent all their spent taxpayer dollars on sex toys, Reddit would still vote for them since they have a D next to their name, even if they could potentially vote for Republicans or the third party as well. And just go show you, people are going to vote for whatever, for a letter next to their name first and foremost, rather than actually voting for what's right. And that's very much how politics works. People don't really care if even the person's living or dead. They'll vote for just the letter next to the name rather than have any consistent principles beyond that. Next, we have Delta 8 THC products come off Texas sales Friday under new state ban, Land of the Free, from USA.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I think that, if Texas wants to take those off the shelf, I think that's fine. Ultimately they can enforce whatever they want taking. I don't think it's fine. I personally am against it, but they have the ability just by taking off whatever they want from the shelves. And yeah, personally, I think for a true free market means you should be able to sell whatever you want to. But ultimately, when it comes to the U.S., it's not a true free market because the state can justify banning certain products, and just because the state bans a product doesn't mean it's necessarily a good product. A lot of illegal drugs are illegal for a reason. I don't think you should be out in the streets shooting up heroin all day. But ultimately, a truly free market means there is no such thing as an illegal product. If you want to buy anything, you should be able to, and you should be able to use it however you want to. As I said earlier, you shouldn't be out in the streets tweaking out on drugs all day. But ultimately, it should be your justification as to what you will do with any product that you buy. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And it looks like I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys. I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys. Let me just check one more time. Yeah, it looks like we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.